I thought, well, that's strange. And I got up to this overlook that was only a mile ahead. Nobody was there. I pulled over and got out, checked for rattlesnakes. They were just starting to stir. And I looked up at the sky, and I couldn't believe how beautiful it was, just oodles of stars everywhere. So I got my binoculars out, and I looked around, and I thought, well, what should I look at first? And then I decided I'll look at the constellation of Orion. That's sort of my favorite spot. I put my binoculars up there, and I just couldn't believe all the stars I could see. The binoculars bring out a lot of faint stars. And some of the faint background stars were twinkling a little. It was windy that night, and moving air caused the stars to twinkle. And I kept thinking every once in a while I would see a flash, but it was small and kind of lost in the background. And I kept thinking to the left edge of the binoculars, there was something flashing every once in a while. So I moved to the left a little, and a few seconds later there was something that flashed a single time. And so I kept my binoculars there, and about 10 seconds or so later it flashed again. There was definitely something up there. It looked maybe stationary, I wasn't sure, but it was at very high altitude, 100,000 feet or better, probably. That's very high. And it was just, every once in a while it would flash, every 8, 10, 12 seconds. And I kept watching it, and it looked like it was moving a little, but not much, and not in a straight direction. It was just drifting around in an area no bigger than a full moon in that part of the sky, a very small part of the sky, but it wasn't sitting still. And it would blink just once every 8, 10, 12 seconds. I kept watching this for 5 or 6 minutes, and it finally started moving in one direction, and I was watching it, but it was going very slow. It was not in a hurry. And I got out my camera and tried to shoot some long exposure shots, not really expecting to get anything because it was so tiny and far away. And I didn't end up getting anything, but when I went back to looking for it in my binoculars, it seemed to be gone. So I looked around for a couple more minutes, and I said, thanks, I appreciate that. I had asked for a sighting of longer duration. I've never had one that long, and I got it. They were very subtle about it. They didn't seem to want to attract much attention, apparently, but they were there. And about 2 minutes later, I saw this thing go streaking across the sky like a meteor, but it just didn't strike me as a meteor. But it could have been, but I didn't see any other meteors while I was out there that whole night, and I felt like it might be them putting on a little air show for me. And then I hopped in my truck and went on down the highway. 35 miles ahead was another small town. I stopped for a moment, got a drink, hopped back in my truck, and as I got up to speed on the interstate, I noticed there was a bright white light at about 2,000 feet going the same direction I was going. It was getting ahead of me, and I was starting to see it in my windshield. I leaned forward, and I watched it for about 5 seconds, and it was as bright as the planet Venus, a white light, and then it just blinked out, like many UFO lights have done before with me over the years. So I guess that was their way of saying, till next time. So I had mentally asked for this sighting, and a week later I got it in the darkest, most perfect place to view anything like this. And as it turned out, I was 150 miles south of Roswell, New Mexico, too. I don't know if that matters, but that was interesting. The next day, I was back in that area again after doing the job and stopped and spent the night. And the motel manager said she had had an up-close personal encounter with the spacecraft right over the highway, not far from there, 2 years ago. She had to pull over. The lights shining down from the bottom of it were so bright they blinded her, she had to pull over. She doesn't remember what happened exactly, but I suspect an abduction. I also talked to a lady at the restaurant at the motel I stayed at that night, and she said she had a friend that lived in the other town that I had seen a UFO at the night before. She had had a close encounter with a UFO in that place. These are the only people I'd met in town that afternoon, and they told me these things. Since the last time I was here, I've had that sighting to occur, and I also had an interesting case to develop. Every once in a while people contact me because of my website, and I had this fellow in California, Long Beach, California, to send me an email one day, and he said, I had a very weird morning today. And he had found me on the internet and decided to, well, he had a compulsion to contact me instead of anybody else. And he's a retired attorney. He was walking to his car across the street, going to his car in a small parking lot. The car was the only thing there. Suddenly, within the blink of an eye, he was somewhere else about 1.5 miles away, sitting in his car parked at a curb. He didn't know how in the world he got there. This is an intelligent man, 55 years old, retired attorney. He was able to retire at 55. Pretty smart guy, apparently. He looked around and he didn't know why he was where he was. He looked at his watch, and it was 20 minutes later, and he doesn't know how that happened. He had just looked at his watch. 20 minutes later. And I think his watch had stopped, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure on that. He went to crank his car, and his car battery was dead. He did manage to crank it after several tries. He looked around, and he was in front of the local Volkswagen dealership. I asked him, what kind of car do you drive? Volkswagen. I thought that was rather odd. I think that he was abducted and they forgot where they picked him up at. The longitude was right, but the latitude was wrong, according to the map. After several tries, he managed to get his car started, so he just pulled right into the service department right there. And he left the car there for a couple of days. In the meantime, I told him, get those mechanics to check that car from end to end and look for anything odd, anything at all odd about that car. They found that the battery was ruined and would not take a charge. It had been exposed to excessive heat. All 4 tires had to be replaced because they had scorch marks all the way around them. They were not in usable condition. Again, from excessive heat. A friend of his, a surgeon, found a small bump on the back of the guy's neck. He pulled something very small out from the bump. Whatever it was turned to powder as soon as it hit the air. I asked the guy later, when we were going back and forth over the next few weeks, emails, what was the very last minor, unimportant detail that happened to you before you were suddenly somewhere else? And he said, well, the only thing I can think of is, I said, was anybody else out there? And he said, well, yeah, the last few seconds before something happened, I never did make it to my car. There was a guy that walked past me on the sidewalk, but there wasn't anything unusual about him. I said, what did the guy look like? Long blonde hair, blue eyes. And the guy got a good look at him. He said it kind of reminded him of a surfer dude. You know, he's only a couple miles from the ocean. Later, he told his story to his sister at a birthday party. He had not talked to anyone in his family about this because he was shook by this. He had no idea what was going on. He was wanting to think that he just had some kind of mental lapse. And if he did, what would happen to him? He'd lose his driver's license eventually. If it got worse, he would no longer be able to do some work as an attorney when he wanted to, things like that. He was very worried about a lot of things. He didn't buy the abduction idea all that much, and I didn't push it on him too much. But he went to his sister and talked to her about it and told her what had happened and mentioned something about the guy with the long blonde hair and blue eyes. And suddenly she stopped him and said, you're not going to believe this, but every time I take little Joey here out to the park nearby, we keep seeing this guy with long blonde hair watching us as though he knows us. It's weird. And we've been concerned about this guy for some time. And what are the odds of all these things happening? This is what I run into a lot of times. Mike could find some explanations, but boy, there's a lot of dots to connect here. And sometimes I just don't know what to make of all this stuff. But I'd like to, somebody's excited. I'd like to open the floor to any questions you may have. There's a lot of things I can still talk about, but last year I ran over, so I wanted to shorten it down some and accommodate you folks. looks a little better. Are there any particular questions on what I've covered so far, or anything between that? Yes. Yeah, once I started learning about all this, I could look back. I thought I was the only person that woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't move. I thought I was the only person. I thought I had some kind of a brain condition or something. When I was a kid, I asked a few of my friends if they ever had that happen. Nope. And I think I used to have nightmare experiences every so often when I was 5, 6 years old. It stopped when I was 7. And I used to dread it, whatever it was. I couldn't figure out what was happening, but I would wake up, I couldn't move, and I was very fearful and full of dread because I knew something was getting ready to happen, but consciously I couldn't figure out what. And at 5 years old, you don't know how to sort things out. And I prayed many times when I was 6 years old or so for this to please stop. And it finally did stop, as far as I know, early into age 7. And I was so thankful that it did. I don't remember it ever happening again after that. I never got sleep paralysis again until I was about 23. And when I did, it was one night when I suddenly woke up and I couldn't move, and I thought, wow, this is the first time this has happened since I was a kid. And I know something was in the room, but I couldn't identify what, and I couldn't look over at it, but something was over there at the foot of my bed, at the corner of my bed. I just couldn't figure out what it was. But I was certain there was something there. And ever since then, I always believed that there is a paranormal world of some kind. I just don't know what it is. And after that, I went on about my business in life like we all do. We're all preoccupied with our personal lives, and we've hardly got time to study things outside our local, personal, daily lives. It's hard to do. It's hard to find the time. But there's a personal interaction going on here, I'm certain. I can trace things back now. I remember when I was 15 years old, something happened and I just dismissed it, but I can remember it now. So chances are they've been tinkering with me since birth or before. A good possibility. Any more questions? Yes.
Do you find any common traits, attributes, backgrounds amongst
No. It's a cross-section of people. It doesn't seem to matter who they are. Any family line can be getting abducted. One common denominator I found, and I don't know whether this is in their DNA or it's just a consequence of what they're being put through subconsciously. These people seem to be at least normal, if not above normal. A lot of them seem to have above normal IQs. They seem to be well adjusted. They seem to be more credible than the average people a lot of times. So it's unusual. But I've found some fascinating people that have told me they've been abducted. Just like in the research community, some of the people I deal with have had experiences, some have not, but they're really fascinating people. You should have been with us last night. But there's some real characters, and we had a good time, but they're above average people in my opinion. I see a lot of above average traits, if anything. And then sometimes it's just regular old Joes. And many times, the people I talk to don't know anything about the subject. We talk and I get things out of them, but they're giving me answers from being naive. They have no idea where I'm going with my questions. And so I'm sensing honest answers from these people. And in many cases, they don't draw conclusions. They don't know what has happened to them. They're asking me, what do I think? But I keep running across the same traits, of these abductions. Certain things seem to always happen. Sometimes sleep paralysis happens. Sometimes it's not remembered. So it varies a bit, but you do have some common traits among the abductees as a rule. Most of them have pretty strong IQs, and they have a curiosity about life that the average people usually don't have. And many of them have a cosmic sense of consciousness. They're more in tune with things of the universe than what am I going to do today around here on planet Earth. A lot of people are just caught up in their culture,